Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this conversation about defending democracy at home. I'm Kim Goff-Cruz, Secretary and Vice President for Student Life. And along with my colleagues, we are honored to work with Secretary Kerry and the Kerry Initiative to sponsor this and many other important conversations. The topic, defending democracy at home, is very special to us. We are, after all, a university that preceded the formation of our American democracy by a full 75 years. Today, we join other colleges and universities to play an important role in nurturing and sustaining our democracy. As Whitney Griswold, the 16th president of Yale, said in 1953, "The freer the society, the greater the responsibilities it imposes upon the individual citizen. And the greater these responsibilities, the greater that citizens' need for the help of the liberal arts." Yale prepares students for lives of civic engagement, public service, and meaningful leadership so that they can fulfill their responsibilities as citizens. And we are expanding access to higher education for students from all backgrounds, extending the reach and the impact of a Yale education. We are engaging in conversations like this one about how to involve more people in the democratic process and deliver on the promise of our national ideals. I know many Yale students and alumni, like our guests on stage today, are eager to tackle this critical work. So let's begin. Our distinguished guests today are two extraordinary Yale alumni, Ms. Stacey Abrams and the Honorable John Kerry. Mr. Kerry, as many of you know, is Yale College class of 1966, and he served as the 68th U.S. Secretary of State under President Obama. Prior to that, he represented the great state of Massachusetts, our neighbor, for over 25 years in the U.S. Senate. He is also a decorated combat veteran who served 2 tours of duty in the Vietnam War. We are proud that Mr. Kerry is a distinguished fellow at Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, and we are grateful for his leadership of the Kerry Initiative at Yale. The Kerry Initiative brings together scholars, practitioners, and experts from diverse disciplines to tackle critical global problems. And Stacey Abrams, our other guest, is no stranger to tackling big problems. A 1999 graduate of Yale Law School, Ms. Abrams served as minority leader in the Georgia House of Representatives from 2011 to 2017. Last year, she became the first African-American woman nominated by a major party in a governor's race in U.S. history. This year, she became the first African-American woman to deliver a response to the State of the Union address. She is at the forefront of efforts to address voter suppression and to strengthen the integrity of the democratic process in this country. Today, Ms. Abrams received the Alumni Achievement Award from Yale Law Women for fighting for the rights and voices of women, of working families, and voters of color. So thank all of you for being with us today, and please join me in giving a very Yale warm welcome to Stacey Abrams and John Kerry.
I love you.
I wish you guys lived in Georgia.
Well, welcome, everybody. Obviously, you are thrilled, as I am, to have Stacey here, and we're very lucky to be able to share her insights on one of the most important issues that we face in America today, which is the fundamental right of our fellow citizens to be able to vote. When I was an undergraduate here, one of the things we first became involved in that age of activism, 1963-4, was the Mississippi voter registration drive. And we had Yale students climbing on to buses over on High Street and giving them a send-off to go down to Mississippi and help people to register to vote. It was dangerous. Obviously, lives were lost. But what's most extraordinary, when I was running for president, I visited Birmingham and I went to the normal civil rights sites that are not normal at all. They're quite remarkable. But what hit me at the Southern Poverty Law Center was the memorial with this fountain and this dial. And on the dial, with water spilling out over the dial, were the names of all of the people who were murdered trying to vote. It's quite extraordinary to remember a time in my lifetime when you were murdered en route to register or after you had registered, just trying to exercise your right. Obviously, our Constitution wrote into it slavery before it wrote it out. So this has been a tortured journey for us as Americans. And I think in the last session that we just had with the 3 secretaries of defense, I was reminded of the degree to which the changes taking place now are also rooted in purposeful exploitation of race and of culture issues. So what Stacey is doing is really much more important than many Americans have yet tuned into. And she's doing it obviously based on a very personal experience, a rather remarkable experience. She wasn't just the first African-American candidate, first black woman to be a nominee for president, for governor. Just a word to the wise, it sounds better than it is. But that said, she did it in Georgia. Georgia, imagine that. It's a big deal. And it was a tough road. I think everybody here, one of the reasons you're all standing up and welcoming her so appropriately is because you know what a big deal it was, but you also know how she handled herself with extraordinary grace and energy. And we're all better for that. So we have a lot to learn here in the next minutes we will all spend together. We will have a section at the very end, towards the end, where we invite questions from all of you. Actually, that's a lie, from a few of you, because we won't answer it. In the spirit of the new age of candor. But I'm really privileged that Stacey saw fit to come here. She also was the first African-American woman from elected official to give the State of the Union response on behalf of our party. So I was tempted just to say, Stace, what you been up to? But before I do, I want to introduce another good friend here, if I may. He just took part in the session we have on Secretaries of Defense. So I've given away, he is a former Secretary of Defense. He's also a former director of the CIA, former OMB budget director, former chairman of the Budget Committee in the House of Representatives, where he spent 16 years, and former chief of staff in the White House. So would you all welcome with me Leon Panetta, everybody. Thank you for being here. My thanks to the Jackson Institute, my thanks to all those at Yale who help us put on events. It's never easy, and we're very appreciative. So let's get right to it. Stacey, since the campaign, you've made it your purpose now to make sure that Americans can vote. And so you've started 2 entities to do that. One is Fair Fight, which is to make sure our campaigns, in fact, are fair and competitive. And the other is Fair Count, which is to deal with the issue of people's ability to be able to vote by virtue of being able to register, by virtue of being counted in the census, and what are the questions it asks. In many ways, it can be said that we have our own modern-day poll tax. We have our own modern-day disenfranchisement in 2019, heading into 2020. 53,000 people in Georgia who did not have their votes counted and were delayed in being able to take part in the campaign because of anomalies in their registration that were not necessarily anomalies at all. Why don't you explain, if you would, what is at stake here? What are the challenges that you see, and how do people sitting here, how do all of us begin to make a difference?
Thank you. Well, first of all, Secretary Kerry, thank you for having me. Thank you to Secretary Panetta, Secretary Albright, everyone here. Thank you.
Can we stop for a minute?
No.
My great brooch-wearing, remarkable Secretary of State, first woman ever to be Secretary of State, ladies and gentlemen, Madeleine Albright.
I truly assumed she was in the earlier panel. I apologize.
That shows you how focused I am.
I'm kind of starstruck, so hi. So for me, this has been, the only thing I've known for a very long time. My parents were very involved in the civil rights movement in Mississippi. I was raised in Mississippi, then moved to Georgia when I was a teenager. And when I was matriculating through Spelman College, when I was at the University of Texas, you can clap for Spelman, it's good. When I came to Yale, I've always been engaged in the question of access. I am driven to do the work I do because I believe poverty is immoral. I think it's economically inefficient. I think it's a waste of human capital, and I think it's solvable. But no one will solve it until those who are most affected by it have a voice in the solution. So that's sort of my macro frame. Back in 2014, I'd served as Democratic leader in the House starting in 2010, and in 2013, I was helping get people signed up for the Affordable Care Act. And through the work we were doing, realized that there were 800,000 unregistered people of color in the state of Georgia, 600,000 of whom were African American. And that elections in Georgia were largely swung by about 250,000 votes. And so my first foray into aggressive voting rights changes was to get this group registered. And that was my first interaction with Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State. And when I registered 86,000 people, we secured registrations from 86,000 people over the course of a 4-month period in all 159 counties. He refused to process 40,000 of our applications. He swore they didn't exist. We knew he was lying because we had copies of them because I didn't trust him, so we kept paper copies of everything. And we actually delivered them to his office. And I tell the story because that was the first moment where I had true understanding of what we were facing in the body of Brian Kemp, but more largely written.
How far from the election was that?
So this was in 2014, and it was, we did our registration project from March to August, and we were fighting him up until Election Day. And part of the challenge was he first swore they didn't exist, and then he accused me of fraud. Because under Georgia law, if you receive an application from any person, you have to turn it in, because you don't want people cherry picking who gets to submit an application. So even if the person hands you back the application and it says that this person is Mickey J. Mouse on 123 Unicorn Lane, the law says you have to turn it in. Well, we flagged those, and we knew that these were not lawful, but Georgia law says you have to turn it in. Well, he then used that to accuse me of fraud. We pushed back, which is something he hadn't faced before. He'd been doing this for the last few years to different organizations who were registering communities of color, but I happen to be the Democratic leader, and I kind of know the law. And so when he accused me of fraud and subpoenaed me, I sued him. But we went through state court the first time, and in state court, our writ of mandamus was thrown out because what we were asking was for the court to force him to process these 40,000 unprocessed registrations. And what the court said is under Georgia law, there is no requirement for timely registration, meaning if you turn your application in, nothing in Georgia law says you have to be processed by the election that you were registering for. So that's the first flaw. And indeed, he did not process them until after the election, January the following year, he quietly processed 18,000 of them. We had new 18,000 people who all missed the election but finally got on the rolls. But we knew that there was still an anomaly with more than 25,000 applications. And as we investigated, we discovered that he was using a system called exact match, where your name on your application had to exactly match either the Social Security Administration database or the DMV, because neither of those places ever make mistakes. And when we took this to a federal court, a federal judge by the end of 2016 said that it was racially discriminatory on its face, and he signed a consent decree saying he would not use that system any longer. Fast forward to the beginning of 2017, and his first stirrings of wanting to run for governor, he reimposed the system by getting the Republican state legislature to pass a state version of exact match. And it was that law that he used to disenfranchise 53,000 people whose applications were dismissed for incredibly banal reasons. So for example, a young man named Del Rios, his last name is Del Rios, D-E-L space Rios. In Georgia, the DMV will not print spaces between your last name. If you have a space in your last name, they will not print it. So when he submitted his application, it got rejected for lack of exact match, because he spells his last name D-E-L space Rios, and he has no reason to know that in Georgia they won't put the space in. But the worst part is no one tells you that's the problem. You just get a note back saying that you cannot be processed and to resubmit. Well, you resubmit with the name God and your parents gave you, and you keep getting rejected. This happened to 53,000 people, 90% of whom were people of color, 70% of whom were African American, and more than half were women.
What percentage of the vote did that represent?
So 53,000 would be about 1,100 fewer than the number I lost by. And I'm not saying all these people would have voted for me, but you had 53,000 people who were never even able to cast a ballot. Now, he says that they were pending, meaning they could go and try, but you had to convince a volunteer worker on the busiest day of the year to essentially overrule what the Secretary of State's office had said. But that's only one part of the problem, and I will wrap it up in this way. Voter suppression is not a single instance. I don't believe that those 53,000 people are purely representative of the problem. They are an example, because voter registration has three pieces. It's registration access. That's being able to get on the rolls, which is what I'm talking about, which we tried to address through voter registration through the New Georgia Project, which is the organization I created in 2014. Voter registration is first. Then it's getting processed, which is the exact match system. Then it's staying on the rolls, which is the use it or lose it laws. And if you know what happened in Ohio, those are the laws that say if you don't vote in a certain number of years, we have the right to strip you of your ability to vote. Not because you're dead, not because you moved, but because we think you should have done it, even though voting is not mandatory in the United States. Millions of people get purged for that reason. In Georgia, we know that 1.5 million people were purged, hundreds of thousands of whom were purged, not because they were not living, not because they were not interested, but because the last time they voted was 2008 or 2012. And he used that as a predicate to remove them from the rolls. Then the second piece is ballot access. So let's say you get through the gauntlet of registration. Oh, and let's not forget voter IDs for people who can't get them because they're too expensive, hard to get, hard to keep, and you don't have the money to pay for it. Then you get to ballot access. Ballot access is shutting down polling places. What they did in Indiana when they removed a polling place where there used to be 10 early voting centers in Marion County, they shut it down and made it one and put it on the outskirts of town, where people who didn't have cars couldn't get to them. In Georgia, Brian Kemp oversaw the closure of 214 polling places out of 3,000. If you are a low-income person who doesn't have access to transportation and you live in one of the many counties, more than 100 counties without public transit, if you get home and try to go and vote and discover that instead of it being a mile away, it's now 10 miles away, you can't vote. So it's ballot access. It's actually being able to do it. And then there were thousands of people who applied for absentee ballots and their absentee ballots never arrived. This happened in Georgia, this happened in Florida, this happened around the country. Then your third piece is ballot counting, otherwise known as Florida. That's when you finally submit a ballot, you try to go and vote. And in Georgia, we had the longest wait times for African Americans in the country, averaging up to 4 hours in some parts of town. We had communities where they were only allocated 2 or 3 machines, and I kid you not, we had one of the busiest polling places where they forgot the power cords for the machines. People waited 4 to 5 hours to vote if they could wait in line, because in Georgia, you cannot lose your job for taking time off to vote, but you don't get paid for it. If you're a shift worker who makes $12 an hour, you took an hour to get there, 4 hours in line, you've now missed almost a day's pay to try to vote, and you have no guarantee you're gonna make it inside. So thousands of people got out of line and went home or went back to work because they simply couldn't afford to vote. That is a poll tax. And then the last was the actual absentee ballot. Well, and in the middle, there's the pushing the machines that we have where they would flip the names. A lot of people voted for me, and Brian Kemp's name appeared on the screens. And then the last was the absentee ballot counting, which is that we had absentee ballots that were rejected at extraordinarily high rates. The highest rate of rejection was in the county in Georgia that has the highest number of naturalized citizens and actually nearly flipped a congressional seat. Across the state, they use what's called signature match, meaning that the signature on the back of your absentee ballot had to match the signature that you used to sign your voter registration card or your ID. My signature does not match from Kroger to CVS. And yet this mismatch was used to justify the rejection of thousands of votes. And so our argument is that individually, each of these may have some legitimate purpose, but when yoked together, registration access, and ballot counting, we now have a de facto disenfranchisement of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of voters, which means there is no fundamental guaranteed right to vote in the state of Georgia. And I would argue that this is playing out across the country. I just happen to be very familiar with what happened to me in Georgia. So that's voter suppression.
So that's that is a terrific example and detailed, obviously, of what can happen. I do not want to relitigate my race for president, but I will tell you that in Ohio, we had waits of 12, 15 hours. We had to go to court to keep lines moving, to keep people able to vote. They voted till 4 or 5 in the morning, particularly in Kenyon College. And machines in the morning, when we started getting telephone calls in Washington telling us that people would go in and push Kerry and it came up Bush. We had those machines taken out. This is after we had gone to court in Ohio to have a verification by experts of the legitimacy of the algorithm which was running these machines. And we were denied that access based on the proposition that it's proprietary information. Private company has the right to maintain the secrecy of it. And the private company was owned by 2 brothers from Nebraska who were both chairmen of the Bush campaign in Nebraska. I mean, it's quite stunning. Afterwards I said, how can it be that in the United States of America, the election of the President of the United States of America is up to a private company's legitimacy with respect to its algorithm that nobody gets to test? Since then, we have found not only were those machines hackable, but the machines today are hackable.
Absolutely.
And that's been proven by people who've gotten in. And you can set an algorithm that takes every 4th vote and siphons it off to the opponent. And then you can write the algorithm in a way that at 8 o'clock, when the polls close, the entire thing disappears. So we're living in a very fragile place with respect to our democracy. And I want to ask you about that. I want you to take it up a little bit. What's the meaning of this now that we have, and I hate to say it, I'm not here to be partisan, and we're going to try very hard tomorrow in our discussions just to be even-handed, but there is just a reality of a certain truth. There is one party in America that goes out of its way to do all kinds of things to prevent people from voting and to engage in voter suppression. And one of those things is the possibility that bots are working overtime, run by the Russians or some other country that wants to impact the outcome of the American election. Now that news became public in your campaign. And I think it's worth your sort of extending the degree to which problems arose as your opponent, who was the sitting Secretary of State responsible for administering the election, was the only state in the country that refused to accept Department of Homeland Security oversight on making sure the Russians didn't engage. Can you speak to that?
So basically, I ran against a cartoon villain. So he's the sitting Secretary of State. He is in charge of oversight of the process. In 2017, before he put his name in the ring to run for governor, he oversaw the purge of more than 300,000 people. We think it's upwards of 600,000. He, in 2016, when approached by the Department of Homeland Security, who identified a number of states that were who had vulnerable systems that were subject to hacking and to manipulation, he is the only Secretary of State who refused the support of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, Georgia had systems that were basically being run by Atari. We have machines that were purchased in 2002. You can no longer upgrade our systems, they are that old. And his response was that, well, nothing's wrong, even though this is the same person who 2 days before the election accused the Democratic Party of somehow hacking the machines he was in charge of. And we found out later that it was because he and his team had mismanaged, once again, the process, and they had been hacked. They just didn't want anyone to know it was their fault, so they blamed Democrats for it. I say all that to say this. The fragility of our democracy is not in the ideal, it's in the execution. And yet we have had a party in the Republican Party, and I am partisan, who've made it their mission to diminish the trustworthiness of our process. And we see that in all of the ways they put in place impediments and peddle falsehoods to seem like truth. But fundamentally what is happening is they are squeezing out communities from being able to participate in democracy. And you see this in what happened in North Dakota, the requirement that Native Americans living on reservations, which are still a stain on our American ideal, being told they have to have residential addresses when we know that does not exist, and with a timetable that made it impossible to solve that problem. We know that in states across this country, we have seen restrictions, and in fact, in North Carolina, they announced their intention was to diminish the validity and the capacity of African Americans to cast votes. Regardless of what you want in terms of power, what worries me is the erosion of our trust in our democracy, because democracy is a theory. It's only made real when people can participate in it and believe it is so. And when the architects of suppression also serve as the leaders and the overseers of the process, people cease to believe, and it has the requisite effect, which is that people stop trying. Voter suppression is incredibly insidious because it convinces you it's your fault or it's not worth it. And that's why it's so dangerous, because when people cease to participate in democracy, then oligarchy starts to rise. And my worry is that when the very leaders who've been entrusted with its protection become the responsible parties for its not only dismantling it, but for diminishing its integrity, we are all in jeopardy. And we saw that play out in Georgia, because while my election was the big election where it played out, I have a Republican friend named Dan Gassaway. Dan and I agree on almost nothing except we both live in Georgia. He is a hard right Republican from a North Georgia county where I think there are 2,500 Democrats out of like 15, 20,000 people. He has had the same election called 3 different times Because while voter suppression may target one community, its corrosive effect eventually affects everyone. And they had to redo a Republican primary 3 different times because of the incompetence of the management of the system. And 3 different times, people who did not live in his district were permitted to vote, and people who lived in his district were not allowed the right to vote. And it had to happen so frequently that we didn't settle a May 2018 primary until last week. And so while both parties may have some culpability, the intentionality of voter suppression from the Republican Party is too glaring to go unchecked. And the last thing I'll say is this. When Mitch McConnell argues that more people participating in democracy is wrong, that it's a power grab, of course it's a power grab. People are trying to grab their power because it's a democracy. That is deeply problematic, and we should be up in arms that the leader of our Senate does not believe that the citizens of America should all be able to have their voices heard.
So, Stacey, the problem. So how are we going to make sure of that?
So a few things. Voter registration. So in 2014, launched the New Georgia Project. We have now registered. We started with a goal of trying to cut into the 800,000 unregistered people of color. Through our own direct efforts, we've already registered 350,000 people of color. And we've helped stand up other organizations or support organizations. We should be able to wipe out that deficit by 2024. That's number 1. Number 2, we have started Fair Fight Action, which has filed a massive, comprehensive federal lawsuit that essentially says it's not sufficient to say that 1 rule or 2 rules are bad. We have to call into question the entire system, and we're using the same theory of the case that they used in Brown versus the Board of Education, which is that it's not a question of whether the law says you can do it. If, in fact, it is happening, then voter suppression is denying the right to vote. And third is Fair Count, which is the U.S. Census program that we're working on, because across the country, we know that the least likely communities to be counted are children, people of color, low income, renters, and immigrants. If they are not counted, they don't show up in the census maps. They therefore don't show up in reapportionment maps. They don't receive resources. And it's cyclical. If you don't receive any support from the government and your life gets worse, then you don't trust the government, so you don't participate in government, so you don't get counted by the government, so you don't trust the government, so you don't participate in the government. And that cycle becomes self-perpetuating. We have to get more people into the process, because you cannot beat voter suppression with silence. You beat it by overwhelming the system with your presence. And everything we're doing in Georgia can be replicated in every state in the country. Everything we do is designed for exportation and replication. You can call it whatever you want. We'll tell you how to do it, and I don't need any credit. But we have to have a national engagement of the urgency of voter suppression and the erosion of our democracy, because it is happening in real time. It is happening in a way that is directly correlated to the demographic changes in our country. And if we do not halt its corrosion and its speed, then we are going to be locked out of our democracy in ways that are going to be untenable in the next decade.
So
you guys are like half clapping. It's okay. You can clap fully or you can not clap. It's okay either way. But there are these air claps that are really interesting.
Make up your minds, in other words.
Just to be clear, that was not a Jeb Bush please clap moment, okay? That was.
So I want to try to put this in the context of the fight we're fighting in America today, which is insidious, because we have a president who is playing to the lowest common denominator of American politics, and therefore trying to find all the divisive issues, immigration, race generally, access, sense, but it's playing to this growing sense, for those of you who read Hillbilly Elegy and other such descriptions of life today in America, it's obvious that a whole bunch of folks are angry. A whole bunch of folks are really feeling economically disenfranchised. And what is happening, in my judgment, and I want your comment on this, is that a very old tactic is being reemployed now. Specifically, I'm drawing from this book called How Democracies Die. Perhaps the most striking example of rewriting the rules to lock in an authoritarian advantage comes from the United States. The end of post-Civil War Reconstruction in the 1870s led to the emergence of authoritarian, single-party regimes in every post-Confederate state. Single-party rule was not some benign historical accident, rather it was the product of brazenly anti-democratic constitutional engineering. What we're seeing today, I think, is an extension of the same thing that drove people then, which was the sudden enfranchisement of millions of African Americans for the first time, and white South decided how they're going to fight it. And the next 100 years were defined by that, except that we got a Voting Rights Act and a Civil Rights Act and some measure of enforcement. But the same strategy, in my judgment, is being employed now by a party that is shrinking in its base. And they're doing it, I think, out of fear and a brazen attempt, as they did previously, to try to engineer outcomes so they don't have the voters, choose the people, they choose the voters by figuring out. Is that accurate? And if so, how do you see that playing out largely in America as a whole? And what do we then do to mobilize so that in 2020, that just can't happen?
So I think we have to remember that this didn't just start, that what occurred in Georgia in 2018 has played out in smaller ways or larger ways across the country for the last 20 years. It's picked up speed and urgency because of the erosion of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 with Shelby versus Holder, which essentially said that any of the constraints on stripping people of their right to vote were removed. But you're absolutely right. The history of the South, post-Reconstruction, African Americans were being elected to office. They were amassing power. They were amassing resources, land. All of this halted immediately post-Reconstruction. Georgia was one of the most egregious states with regards to how they stripped power, because one thing they created was this county unit system. And that said that in order to win an election, you had to win a certain number of units per county, and every county was attributed a similar number of units. Well, as cities grew, which were largely driven by African American populations, you would have a city like Atlanta that had 10 times the population as another county, but would have the exact same voting power, which meant that rural communities, which were largely white and poor, were able to overwhelm more diverse communities whose population did not at all direct the value of their vote. This may not sound familiar to anyone who's ever paid attention to the Electoral College. But the other piece of it was that what Republicans, and it was actually, let's be clear, Republicans were actually the saviors during post-Reconstruction. They quickly forgot that by the time you get the Democrats. They were, in the South, Democrats were largely Dixiecrats, meaning that we were a single-party rule, but it was a very confused party that contained multitude. And the civil rights activists of the 1950s were in the same party as Bull Connor. And that really created a confusion about what it meant to be a Democrat in the South, but let's put that aside. What they learned from the process and what we've seen play out in the last 20 years is that what used to be facially, racially tinged, things that were intentionally targeted towards people of a certain race, now have the benign air of universality. It's not that black people can't vote. It just so happens that we have defunded your counties and you don't have the resources to pay for what you need. It's not that Latinos can't vote. It's just that we have decided that English is the only language that can be spoken, and if you speak any other language, then you really shouldn't be allowed to read the ballot, even if you're a U.S. citizen. It is using what are seen as facially neutral standards to impose what are largely racial imprimaturs on how you limit access. And it is systemic, and it is systematic. It began with voter ID, because voter ID, there was never a rash of voter fraud. We can't get 50% of people in America to do anything. No one is putting on a wig and a mustache to vote twice. What happened was that across the country, post-2004, people started voting because they saw that if they voted, things could change, and they were angry enough that they started voting. And suddenly, voter IDs came into fashion, and for the first time, the Supreme Court in 2006 said that voter IDs were okay. That knocked out a whole community of people, including people in the South, many of whom of a certain age did not have access to IDs because they don't drive cars, they can't afford it, they don't live near places where it's easy to get an ID. And if you're in Alabama, in 2017, they shut down all the places where you could go get an ID intentionally to preclude anyone of color, largely African Americans, from getting the IDs they needed. But on its face, it was simply, we just think everyone needs to have an ID. It just so happens that this is directly correlated to income and race. It's the access to the polling places, shutting down polling places on college campuses, because the most likely Democratic voters tend to be young people of color, and suddenly across the country, young people are no longer allowed to have ease of access to voting. In the state of Georgia, you cannot use your state ID issued by a college as photo ID to go and vote. In Texas, you can't use a student ID, but you can use your gun license. Not that that privileges one group over the other. And so, to your point, this has been, and it will continue to be, a systemic process because the nation is changing. And there's one party that is heterogeneous, that is intentionally diverse, not necessarily always great at managing that diversity, but at least we know it exists. And there's another party that is shrinking demographically, that is homogeneous, and that recognizes that the loss of power that is directly correlated with an increase in diversity means a diminution in not only power, but in resources, in money, and in the ability to impose values. When you recognize that that's what's happening, you start to see every law and every rule in a different light. And that is that this is very intentional. And what we have to do heading into 2020 is sound the alarm. That is why everywhere I go, no matter what I do, I talk about voter suppression. We have to talk about it as relentlessly as the lie of voter fraud is spread. Because if we do not call it what it is, we will not address it. The same way we have been talking, it's taken 20 years to get people to really think about climate change as a true emergency. We don't have that kind of time. If we want to save our planet, if we want to save our people, we have to acknowledge voter suppression, because the only way power changes hands is either you wrest it through military means or revolution, or, as we do in a democracy, you vote out those who are against your values, and you vote in those who share your values. And what they are doing their best to do is stop the conversation of values from being a real one in our body politic.
So,
and just for Breitbart, I'm not suborning or encouraging revolution. Just
I see there are a group of you getting a tan right in the middle there. You guys all right? Stacey, what is the impact, broadly? I want you to reach a little bit beyond just the voting. But what does the current politics mean for this next election? And how dangerous is what you see now in American politics to our aspirational democracy?
we see examples, you said it very well. We see examples of authoritarian behavior made manifest in the current occupant of the White House, who has intentionally bypassed the Senate by creating acting secretaries of almost every major department, who has tried to use executive authority in ways that are not only unusual but are directly contrary to the law. And when he's faced with laws he doesn't like, he blithely ignores them, knowing that there are very few consequences for that decision. We have a codependent Senate being led by those who are benefiting from the ineptitude, but also the ignominy of the president. And so, yes, you get a tax cut, but you also get, the war in Yemen. And so part of the responsibility we have is that we have to reclaim our international reputation, which cannot be reclaimed until we prove that we are actually still a democracy. And that means a very robust engagement in the 2020 election, not only to change the leadership, and you can vote for a Democrat, or you can vote for William Weld. It is most important that we replace the current occupant with someone who actually respects the presidency and respects the integrity of our national standing. And that's what we don't have. And why this is so troubling is that everything follows from it. There was this week the multilateralism conference where Germany and Japan and France are trying to step into the void left by the United States because we are no longer seen as a legitimate partner in multilateralism. That is a terrifying reality, that the United States of America is no longer seen as a partner to most nation states on the key and core issues that determine our success as a global community. Voting in its most abstract is simply a statement of principles. And if we do not vote and say that our principles believe that we may not get everything we want, but we at least want to have a robust debate, then we cease to be who we have stated we are as Americans for more than 2 centuries. And why that terrifies me is that things don't simply stop because America ceases to participate in the way it should. In fact, we know there's an acceleration of the erosion of global democracy. If you're watching what's happening in India, the fact that after Netanyahu's election, it was Trump, Pence, and Modi who called. That's a question. If you look at what's happening in Indonesia, what's happening, yes, you know better about Bashir and what happened in Sudan, but you've got dozens of other nation states that are on the brink of both explosions in population and erosion in democratic principles. That poses a physical harm, and I know that was a larger conversation. But for me, the macro construct is that we stand as an example of what should be, in part because of how badly we have failed. America is an example of why democracy is important because we have had to correct ourselves so many times, acknowledging that black people are actually wholly human, acknowledging that women should be allowed to be a part of the body politic, making Native Americans citizens, moving away from our very xenophobic immigration policies over time. Each of those moments of correction stand as signals to the rest of the world that we can get better. Not that democracy is perfect, but that we are made more perfect by each of our corrections. And when we stop correcting ourselves, and worse, when we celebrate our ignominy, we undermine our value as part of an international conversation.
Do you think there's enough awareness and energy right now that is focused on this so that we can actually do what we need to do in the next X number of months?
I think it's...
In other words, do we need to rekindle the civil rights movement in America around this issue fundamentally?
I think we do. But I think I would frame it as less a civil rights issue and more an existential crisis. If you believe in climate change, if you think that you may die because the world is going to explode, if you think that climate change is real, even if you don't agree with anything else, the right to vote is the only way we will make climate change policy real. If reproductive choice is your issue, the only way we make reproductive choice real is the right to vote. If your issue is economic security and whatever your issue is, the right to vote is our only mechanism. And so I don't think it's recasting this as a core civil rights conversation, in part because people can exempt themselves from that. They're not bad, they didn't do it, therefore they don't have an obligation. The right to vote is one that, when guaranteed for all, guarantees for all. And I want us to have a broader understanding that this is not simply a construct that is attributable to how African Americans are harmed, because people find it not easy, but there are many ways in which if a single community is harmed, you are exempt from participation. We have to recognize that this is a corrosion across all of our rights. It may target African Americans, but it's going to get us all. And so for me, the larger conversation is that we have to reclaim our democracy. If that's our goal, then we have space for more people to join, whether they think that as an African American, I am the direct target of the harm. Because if the harm, it's the effect of, you may aim at me, but if others are hit by collateral damage, the damage is still real. And therefore, we should all be engaged in the fight, which is not, certainly as a matter of morality, it should be do it because it's the right thing to do. I come from the body of politics, do it because it helps you too, so let's get it done.
So if I wasn't here interrupting your train of thought with questions, and you were just
Sorry.
throwing, no. And you came out here, this audience was here, and you're here to talk about what you're doing. I assume you would focus on the problem, you'd describe it, then you'd focus on the macro 40,000 foot, here's why we got to do it. But then I assume you would also get pretty basic into their gut.
Yes.
And say, if you want to do this, if you want to do that, here are the things, this is why you need to go out and vote. What are those? What are you compelling people to go vote on now?
And that's my point. I don't think I have to tell you to go vote for the issue that motivates me. I need you to vote because of what motivates you. But more importantly, you need to make space and create opportunities for others to go vote so they can do what you want. I find that selfishness is the most effective means of moving people in politics ever. And not in a narcissistic way, but in the true notion of selfishness that my benefit sometimes means that I'm going to do more to make my benefit real. Therefore, the issues that animate you should be the reason that you create space for other people to participate. Fighting against voter suppression makes your possible realities real. The continuation of voter suppression dulls the likelihood of you getting the change you need. And so, one, it is not only making sure you're registered, but participating in the conversation about registration for others. It is not only making sure that you get counted by the census, but making sure you're participating in groups that are making sure the census is made real for others. It's finding the issue that animates you and compelling the organizations you support to make certain that their voices are being heard by ensuring that people can engage in politics. And the reality is, if we do not solve this in 2020, let's be really clear. If we do not solve it in 2020, we are talking about another 4 years of crippling erosion. If you thought the last 2.5 years were bad, imagine 4 years and no consequences. It's recognizing that the urgency of the moment is made incredibly real because of all of the other issues that have been hinted at but not acted on. Yes, we have seen attacks on transgender communities, on immigrants, on Black people, on women, but there are a lot of other people out there that he doesn't like. And, he might start with us first, but he's coming for the rest of us. And then the third is that we deserve better. We deserve to preserve our democracy. And so the action item is make sure you're registered. I mean, I assume if you're sitting in this room, you're registered. I'm preaching to an incredibly large choir. But you all have the ability to then activate other communities. Every one of you touches churches, synagogues, mosques, community groups that should make this their intention for the next 18 months. We should not relent on the conversation of voter suppression because it is a relentless fight to take out our values. If you doubt it, look at the turnout that we saw across this country. In Georgia, in 2014, 1.1 million people voted for Democrats, 1.25 million voted for Republicans. In this last election, 3.8 million people voted, 1.9 million Democrats. 1.9 million Democrats were allowed to be counted voting. 1.9 million plus Republicans with a margin of 54,000. That is a dramatic increase, and it is a direct result of me spending 18 months telling people that I needed to hear their voices. The answer, the call to action, is talk to other people to let them know their voices matter. You have to ask people to vote. Do not assume they will do it because they're as worried as you are. For a lot of communities, they're worried every day. This is just another worry. You have to connect the dots. And you can connect the dots through every person you touch, every organization you touch. But we have to believe that if we do not solve it, because when reapportionment happens, when the census happens, that's the next decade of power. That's it. That's the ballgame. And if people are not counted, they do not count. If people are not heard, they are considered to be acquiescing to what is happening. And I don't believe that's really the case.
What's the most important reform that you think could make a difference? States manage the elections. Is there a federal reform that could make the greatest difference?
Automatic registration. Automatic voter registration solves a lot of problems. There should be
automatic with
automatic upon turning 18. I think automatic registration. If we've said federal law says you can vote when you're 18, everyone should be automatically registered. They can find your money the minute you make it. They can find you. So
what name are they using? If you do that, what name are they using? How do you get away from this name problem?
There is no name. We've been convinced that there is somehow this deeply complicated process that has to be put in place. India is running an election with 900 million people, and they have a federal law that says you do not have to travel more than 1 mile to cast a ballot.
I understand. What I'm asking you is, it's not that it can't be done or there aren't 10 ways to do it. It's that you have these built-in structural impediments. So you yourself have talked about Del Rosio. So if it's automatic registration and the registration doesn't have it spelt right or has a space in it, you got a problem.
Well, so I would argue that we do what they do in California, Oregon, are the two states that I think have the most robust automatic registration. They can use your state ID to register you, or they can use your birth certificate. You're going to always have to have corrections, but if the process begins with the presumption that you were registered, then everything else is making sure you're doing correctives to make it real, as opposed to what we have now, which is a gauntlet that you have to run in order to even get added to the rolls.
And I presume you would support the notion that it shouldn't be so hard to vote because you have to skip work and lose your job or lose a day's pay. We ought to have 4 or 5 weeks you vote and mail in.
Georgia.
And automatic ballot.
Absolutely.
But that should happen all across the country to enfranchise people.
And that's why I think it has to be federal law. I think federal law should permit, so I don't just pick one, automatic voter registration. There should be mail-in ballot should be permitted everywhere. Now, I do think that certain states are going to have more complicated rules, but those rules should always be, we should set a floor for what happens, not a ceiling. And the floor should say automatic registration, multiple ways to access an election, multi-week. I mean, Georgia actually has really good early voting laws. We have.
Well, shouldn't we have a standardized requirement for votes for federal office for a president of the United States? Certainly.
Standardized in what way?
What?
Standardized in what way?
Standard that you have a standardized set of rules by which people across the country are going to vote for president by virtue of automatic registration, certain amount of time.
Absolutely.
Standard ballot requirements. I mean, it's absurd that the ballot can differ place to place.
Exactly.
And be screwed up, frankly,
I
by the
completely
local, by some friendly Secretary of State, right?
I completely agree. I think, and that's my point. I mean, what H.R. 1 argues is that we need to set a federal floor for what is permitted in the operation of elections. Right. Automatic registration, same-day registration, which basically allows you to correct any mistakes, that there is uniformity in how much time, there's at least a limit, there's at least a floor for how much time that can be allowed. Now, you can decide you want to give people more time, you can decide to give them more options, but you can't give them fewer options. And more importantly, that the federal standard has to be the standard used for every level of election within reason. So with registration, not necessarily with execution of an election. I don't think you need 6 weeks to vote for dog catcher. But I do think that access to the ballot, registration access should be uniform and should not be eroded by any state action.
And how about national popular vote electing the president?
Yes,
What do you think of that?
I completely agree with it. It is misinformation to say that the Electoral College was designed to help smaller states versus larger states. That wasn't the case. It was designed because we didn't trust non-land owning, uneducated people to know enough to cast a ballot. It was, once again, it was this notion of the gentry protecting the serfs, although we were a democracy, and it no longer has relevance. We should be able to elect our presidents directly. They lead us. We should have a say in how they lead and who they are. And I co-sponsored the national popular vote legislation in Georgia.
So, so what are we going to do about, and you as a leader in the House confronted this every single day, the level of polarization. America has never been more polarized since perhaps the age of Father Coughlin in the 1930s and back around the Civil War period. But pretty hard to get people to talk to each other. We used to be able to come together, Republican and Democrat. We'd go out to dinner, we'd talk, get to know each other, have a good dinner at some senator's house, Republicans, Democrats alike. I remember going over to Ted Kennedy's house, and you'd have Orrin Hatch and John Warner of Virginia, and Mac Mathias, and then a group of Democrats, and you'd sit around talk about health care, and you go back to the Senate the next day and get something done. That doesn't happen anymore. They barely work now. They come in on a Monday night or Tuesday, they vote, they're there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the Senate's become like the House, and they don't do anything. So how are we going to break this fear people have of holding their own president accountable to things they know are morally and otherwise wrong? But accountability has disappeared. And by the way, when you read any treatise about how democracies disappear and the insidious undermining of them, there are plenty of them that have disappeared over time. Hitler came to power in a democracy. He was given power by the government who thought they were going to control him. Same thing with Chavez. I mean, you can run a list of places where people came because the governing people thought, oh my God, there's this movement. Well, maybe we can control. Mussolini, same deal, folks. So you got to sort of look at history here to understand that when people shy away from holding people accountable, that's one of the first big underminings of democracy. And that's what's happening today with the Republican Party that cares more about president and party and power than they do about upholding the Constitution of the United States. It's bad.
I agree.
How do we do that? So
I've never been either in real power, because I was in the minority when I was the leader in the House, and I've never been in Congress, but I will say this. One of the reasons I was able to navigate and get things done, even though I was outnumbered nearly 2-to-1 in the House, was that they needed me. When you have to compromise, when you have to negotiate, when what you want requires someone else's consent or participation, your ideological differences don't disappear, but they become modulated by your desire for this other thing. I think the elimination of earmarks was the death knell of compromise in our Congress. I think that earmarks required negotiation, because you would then go home and be able to show, I delivered this to my community, and in the delivery, I had to get along with someone else to make it so. When you no longer have that incentive for forced negotiation, then what people are judged on now when they go home is how mean are you to the other side? How intractable are you? How much can you demonize the opposition? And because most of our elections are decided in primaries, there is no incentive to elect someone not of moderate views, but of moderate process. You don't have to be, I am a progressive, but I operate with moderation in my process, meaning I will talk to anyone, and I won't call your mama names in order to get something done. I will actually engage you, and in the process, I will learn who you are. Someone I knew very closely in the legislature, his name was Bobby Franklin. Bobby, hard right conservative, who used to say that pages of my Bible were missing because he just didn't understand how I believed what I believed. It was not a compliment. He would introduce at the beginning of every legislative session a bill to repeal the right to an abortion in Georgia. I got to know Bobby. I would sit there and talk to him because I wanted to understand why he believed what he believed. And in the process, I mean, like the dinners you described, I never tried to change Bobby's opinion about abortion, but I understood them. And one day we had an anti-abortion bill that was based on this this thing they were running. They were trying eugenics as an argument that abortions were bad because they were killing black babies, and therefore they were able to get a bunch of African Americans to sign on to the legislation, and they were going to move it because that was the wrong kind of abortion. And it's such a fallacious argument, we don't have to deal with that piece. But I sat with Bobby, and I said, look, you've told me that you believe fundamentally under your Christian values that abortion is wrong on its face. And he said, yes. I said, so how can you vote for a bill that says this kind of abortion is the only abortion that's wrong? Either you think it's all wrong or you think it's okay. Now, because I talked to Bobby, because I got to know him, we were able to go into that committee hearing. And when the vote came, Bobby voted with me. And we stopped the bill. And his allies, his colleagues, were stunned because they'd never bothered to talk to him. They presumed they knew what he would do because of how he'd always behaved. And so part of it is you have to have incentives, and I think earmarks are one example, but the other is that you have to have humanity, which is that you get to know other people, especially those who don't share your values. We stopped a bill because the staunchest anti-abortion person there voted with me. And as he told them, it was because I held him true to his values. Now, disagreed with him, fought him, wanted him to lose, but that didn't mean I couldn't talk to him and get to know him so we could get good done. And that's the other way I think we can help repair our politics.
So I'm gonna ask one more question, and then we're gonna turn to you folks and give you a shot here to get into this dialogue directly. But I do want to touch on one thing before we do that. You mentioned it earlier, but I want to get everybody to really intensely focus on this and understand the implications. The 2020 census will determine congressional districts for the next 10 years. We have a level of gerrymandering in the United States today that makes literally it's impossible for us to have a truly democratic election in countless districts across this country. And that is a source of enormous frustration to many Americans because you don't get a choice between the two parties. It's decided in a primary. And then there's no genuine democracy electing the members of the Congress. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court did not do what many of us hoped it might. There are other cases sort of bubbling up. But the key here is going to be making sure people are counted. And I would like you really to try to focus in and emphasize that. And so say what you've learned from this as a legislator and otherwise.
So when I came into the legislature, it was 2006. I came in after the third lawsuit in Georgia on our maps. So let's be clear, gerrymandering is not the province of Republicans. Democrats did it for decades. Democrats did it, Republicans did it. What is different is how they do it. So when I became Democratic leader, so I came in the legislature in 2007, I became leader in 2010, so my first year of leadership was the year of reapportionment. It is a terrible time to start your job when you're guaranteed to not win. We have 180 seats in the House. The Republicans drew themselves a map that allocated 124 out of 180 seats. This is despite an election that was determined by fewer than 4 points. So this was not a 66-34 election. This was 45-55. And yet they allocated themselves 2/3 of the House. They'd already taken the Senate in a supermajority. Part of the reason they were successful was that Georgia had a dramatic undercount of almost 20 to 30%, largely people of color. And therefore, when the lines were drawn, even though I knew that in Douglas County there was this burgeoning community of African Americans, they did not show up on the map. And therefore, the lines could be drawn to essentially push them out of having any say in their election. They knew where they lived. They just didn't, I didn't have proof because the census didn't show them. And so what Republicans did was they packed African American districts. They isolated Latinos and put them in small pockets so they could never coalition. And then they scattered Asian Pacific Islanders because they assumed they would vote Republican, so it wasn't really a big deal. And as a result, they were able to give themselves a supermajority in the Senate and come close to winning the House. If those populations, now what we did in the following year, because I knew where these people lived, was that we actually were able to claw back 4 of those seats and stop a supermajority because I knew there were black people in Douglas County. I knew there were a lot of Latinos in Gwinnett who hadn't been counted. I knew that in certain parts of the state, communities of color had been ignored. And I went into those communities early with teams, we did the work, and we were able to get those populations to vote. But that's a lot of work. It is an easier thing to make sure they get counted in the first place. One, because it allows you to have standing when you are suing against whatever maps come to fruition. If you cannot prove people exist, you have no standing to argue that they're being disenfranchised. And the only proof point is the census. Number 2, the resources you need in order to make certain that those communities are served and therefore feel like it's necessary to be involved in the body politic come through the census. If they are ignored in 2020, they will not get services for a decade. If your schools are overcrowded, if they are under-resourced, it is likely because the children in those communities were not covered and not counted. And third is gerrymandering. Because of the erosion of the Voting Rights Act, the ability to prove that maps are unlawful, the burden is now so extraordinary as to be almost impossible to meet. You have to prove that someone stood in the well in the General Assembly and said, I hate this group of people and I'm going to steal their votes. Outside of Pennsylvania, that hasn't really happened recently. And therefore, the legal remedies we've had in years past to actually fix these maps are nearly gone. But let's remember, we still have cases from 2010 that are pending before the Supreme Court. Texas, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, we've had some resolutions, but it's taken almost 10 years to fix what was broken a decade ago. We don't have a decade to wait. Because if we lose the House, if we lose the House of Representatives and we head into another 4 years of the current leadership, or possibly worse, then we have no remedy to solve it. The census is our remedy, and we have to take it seriously. And that is in every state, everywhere. And the last point I'll put in on is this. California, I think, is spending almost $200 million on their census. I think Georgia's allocated less than $1 million. California is not 200 times larger than Georgia. But Georgia has no incentive to count the people who are not being counted. And that's why we've started the work we're doing. But that work needs to be done across the South and across the country.
So, folks, we're going to have a chance to ask a few questions. I'm going to give the first shot to the former Secretary of Defense. This is an inside job. I don't have a clue what he's going to say, though. Leon Panetta. Do you have a mic? No, the mics are coming. Do we have mics? I know we had a couple of handheld mics.
First of all, thank you for your leadership on behalf of Thank you for your leadership on fighting for our democracy. I appreciate the work and the sacrifice that you've engaged in. Let me ask you this, because I recognize that in trying to deal with registration, you've got to go to every state, and all 50 states have their own rules, and it's a hell of a fight. First of all, could you identify those states that do it right and that are a model for other states? And secondly, is there, with artificial intelligence and all of the other technology that's developing these days, is there a technological way to deal with this issue on both registration and voting?
Sure. I would say that Washington State, Oregon, California have all done very, very tremendous jobs on voter registration. Rhode Island, I think, is doing really well. So on registration, their automatic registration, same-day registration. Maine has gone back and forth, but they've usually been good actors. When it comes to voting, Colorado has an extraordinary system where they have incredibly high participation rates. Same, again, I would say what happens in Oregon is an example, and Washington State are exemplars of what works well and could be replicated across the country. I think the issue with expansion of the franchise, there's technology that can make it easier, but we've bought into this narrative that there was a problem to begin with. There is no problem. There is not a rash of people who are scheming to vote. That's not the issue. And therefore, all of the solutions to forestall that non-existent problem have created a complicated system where no complication needs to exist. What we do have to worry about is the technology that counts the votes, which is why I believe in hand-marked paper ballots, because our systems are vulnerable. There was a brief spate of time where where the technology was vulnerable, but the sophistication wasn't high enough for there to be the level of worry, but that was probably like 2 years. But for the last 15 years, we have been in a state of aggressive vulnerability where our ability to audit our elections and prove that what people said is what happened has been non-existent. That is deeply problematic. In Georgia, the state buys all of the machines for everyone. So one set of flaws affect an entire state. Other states do it by county, but counties have varying degrees of resources, so their ability to actually fix their equipment is limited to how well funded that county is, and that's often based on the census. And so we have to start demanding, sometimes the cheapest solution is the best. Paper works. I'm going to stop there.
So, is there another? We've got a little bit more time still. Is there another question somebody wants to ask? Yes, ma'am. Yes, right here, third row. We've got a mic coming to you. Just hold on one sec.
Thank you. My name is Lorena Chambers. Had the honor to work with you, Senator Kerry, Secretary Kerry, on your campaign, but also with Madam Leader Abrams, with Power Pack Georgia, and we were the independent expenditure down there. We had legal battles on the IE side consistently with stations, Republican-run media folks tearing down our ads. I'm happy to say they stayed up because we had a great legal team and a good research team, and we did great ads on your behalf. I'm feeling that from 2000, 2004, 2016, and now with your race, I run into folks saying always, there is no difference between the two parties. In order for us to be able to motivate this entire room to go out in legions to work on census and for registration, I find it in my polling over and over again, we didn't have any difference in 2016 candidates. There is no difference now. What's the reason? What's going to change? I know that we hear this all the time, but I would love to hear from both of you, from so many experiences, what it is that we can use, that kernel of evidence that we can share with others so that we can motivate many more than just 50% of the electorate to actually register and do good work. Thank you for your service.
Kernel of evidence about?
I'm sorry?
Kernel of evidence regarding?
Of the difference. I know there's a difference,
Right.
but yeah.
Stacey, go ahead.
Here's the thing. People don't care about your party. They care about their lives. And as long as elections are run based on which party is evil or not evil, it's a pox on both their houses. I believe in talking about the issues that matter and then using those issues to say that I am the person and my party supports these values and therefore this is why you vote this way. But as long as it begins and ends with partisanship, people aren't going to be invested because the 50% of the people we need to show up, they've never seen either party do much for them. But they do know what's wrong, they do know what they're missing, and what they want to hear is that you have a solution and that by engaging, the solution will become real and manifest for them. One of the reasons I didn't concede my election was that for so long, we have condoned the process. We have condoned the outcome. And if you condone the outcome, then you're condoning every participant in the outcome. And so part of the reason for me to say I will legally acknowledge the outcome, but I won't concede, was that we had to be seen for all those people who did show up, who broke through that 50% barrier and got up to 63%. They needed to see that I heard them and that I didn't suddenly forget them in order to protect my party or my political future. They needed to see that I was willing to say, you were not given your choice, that you were robbed, that your voice was stolen, and that this is not about me becoming governor, this is about you having your rights heard. When it's about the voter, then people show up. When it's about the candidate, they can stay home. It doesn't really matter.
I agree completely with that, and I think we're going to have to wrap up in a moment here, but let me just say to everybody, I don't think that in reality we have two functional parties. We have loose-knit labels. And people fall one side, which is sort of to the right of American politics, and people fall to the other side, which is some variation of left in American politics. And they run under that banner, but they really run very individually. And I would not spend time talking about party. I'd spend time talking about what matters. What are the issues around which you want to organize your life? What do you want for your kids? What's bugging you? What do you need to have addressed? And hopefully the people who are running have the ability to address that. Now, you know, my sense is that this is where I wanted to sort of wrap it up as we come to the end here, particularly to all the undergrads here and grad students, to all of you currently studying at Yale. Please remember, and it's not an exaggeration, there's no reach in my saying this to you. And the reason I say there's no reach is because I know what we did before. In 1970, we brought 20 million Americans out of their homes to organize around the idea that people didn't want to live next to a toxic waste site. They didn't want to be given cancer from the Woburn dump. They didn't want to watch the Cuyahoga River light on fire. These were fundamental concepts. Rachel Carson drove our generation to try to say we want to be able to see from one end of a city to another and not breathe smog. So 20 million Americans came out, but we didn't stop with that. We politicized a movement to make the issue a voting issue. And we targeted the 12 worst votes in the United States Congress. And we went after them in the 72 election. And guess what? 7 of the 12 were defeated. You know what happened? All the survivors had their spines stiffened by their survival and said, oh my God, this is a voting issue now. And what happened? We passed the Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Marine Mammal Protection, Coastal Zone Management. We actually created the Environmental Protection Agency for the United States of America. We didn't have one until people demanded accountability. Accountability. That's what you have to do. And if only 31% of young people are voting, which means 69% are not, we got a problem. There's no question in my mind there is a majority in this country ready to do the reasonable things we need to do for the country. But it ain't gonna happen if you all aren't the blood and guts of those efforts, because all of what I'm describing happened because young people got involved. The movement for that environment, it was inspired by Senator Magnuson, but it was effected and carried out by a young organizer called Dennis Hayes, who lives in Seattle, Washington now, and still helps with Earth Day, manages Earth Day. And we're going to join. I'll let you in a little lead on Monday. I think Dr. Ernie Moniz and I are going to announce a new major global effort to rekindle this kind of activity so people will go out and, damn it all, vote to hold them accountable if these clowns are going to pretend that climate change isn't happening. Throw them out. So, democracy does not work unless it is serviced day to day by hard work. And people have just kind of, I don't know, they're happier playing video games or happier going, I don't know, it's crazy. But they'll be the first to complain that nobody's doing anything about climate change or the parties aren't different. Of course the parties are different. You can find the differences in a nanosecond. So this is what we have to do. And I cannot tell you how privileged I feel and excited I am to have Stacey here talking about what she is doing. everything she has said here today will not do what it needs to do unless you all are going to follow up. She can't do it alone. No leader can do what we need to do now in our country alone. It has to be everybody on deck, everybody engaged, nothing more worthwhile. So be the next generation of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich brigade that went to New Hampshire and told Lyndon Johnson he couldn't run for president again. That's what we did. The women's movement, we came close to having an equal rights amendment. We made great advances towards that glass ceiling, which still needs to be broken. But we're making progress. We got the civil rights law passed. We opened up voting more than it's ever been before. Not good enough, but we can get there. So the bottom line is, Stacey is heroic in what she is doing by learning and recognizing from a very bitter experience, but turning it into something that she's committed to do to change the country and make the country what it's supposed to be. And we're all so proud of you, and we're so grateful to you for what you're doing. Thank you for your leadership. Keep it up. Make it happen. Wait 1 second. I have one. Wait a minute. I have to say.
Thank you.
I got to tell you. Wait. I have one thing I want to say. Am I allowed to do this?
You are.
Okay.
You have my consent.
Okay. I don't know how many of you know this, but Stacey is an author of romance novels.
Yes.
Now, I have not read, I hate to say it, I haven't read them yet, but I am hoping that this experience today has convinced her that in her next novel, there is a place for a former Secretary of State with some gray hair who deserves to be in your next romance novel.
I will make it work, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.